Once your account has active contracts in it, you can start invoicing by clicking where it says Add New at the top of the screen and selecting Invoice. From here, you'll be prompted to select which job you're sending the invoice for, and it'll let you know what type of billing is associated with this project. For the fixed price job, you'll be able to select from different invoicing methods. Method 1 will allow you to invoice a percentage of progress on individual line items in the contract. So for instance, I could put in 50% of demolition, but 25% of framing. With method 2, we can also invoice by line item, but instead of using percentages, we have the option of entering a lump sum dollar figure instead. You also have the ability to invoice the entire value of the contract on the whole. If we select method 3, we can enter in a percentage of the entire contract value instead of breaking it down into individual lines. And with method number 4, you have the ability to enter in a dollar figure out of the total contract value and keep invoicing until the whole contract has been billed. And if you've used units when creating your contract, you have the ability to select method number 5 to enter how many units you'd like to bill in each invoice. For this invoice, we'll select method number 1 and enter the percentage of each line that we want to invoice in this period. You'll see that we have more options as well to control what we display on the invoice document, whether it's the item description, information from the breakdown or bill of materials, or if we want to hide our percentage of completion. This will automatically pull the items into the invoice and mark the items taxable if they were marked as taxable in the contract. We also can set an invoice number here and a PO number if it was referenced by the customer. We can set the invoice date if we need to back or forward date this transaction, and we can select our payment terms, which would come in from QuickBooks. And when everything is correct, we can click Verify and Finalize at the top of the screen. We'll be given the option to send an email to the client with this invoice and send this invoice to our QuickBooks account. We'll click Finalize and Prepare Email, and on the next screen it'll show us a preview of the invoice and allow us to write an email that we'll send to the client. These invoice documents can also be customized by Knowify if you email a request to support@knowify.com. When we click Discard, we'll be brought to the Invoice Details page. The check mark next to Send via email shows that this is successfully synced to QuickBooks and gives us a link directly into the QuickBooks account so we can view the transaction. Now that the job has been invoiced, we can go back to our contract jobs table and see that this value has been recognized as revenue on the job. In fixed price contracts, we also have the ability of sending a schedule values invoice. Selecting this option at Additional Options in the bottom of the contract will create a different type of invoice document that shows the total value of a line item, the amount billed to date, the amount being billed in this period, and the total amount remaining in the balance of this specific item on the contract. Next, we'll cover how to create AIA-style invoices in Knowify. When you're setting up the job, you'll want to set your contract style to fixed price with AIA-style billing. Then, we'll create the contract just like any other fixed price contract, only when it's active, you'll have additional fields to fill in before invoices can be created. The GC contract number and GC contract date are mandatory fields in order to start creating AIA invoices, and you'll also have the opportunity to enter in your retainage for work and stored materials. Once this information has been entered and saved, you'll use the same Invoice Now button at the top right corner of the contract screen. It'll pull you to a page where you select the date of the billing period to communicate to the customer how much of the job this invoice is covering. When the date is selected, you'll be prompted to enter in a percentage of completed work and a dollar figure for stored materials. And you'll want to make sure that the total value of completed work plus the amount of stored materials is less than or the same value of the value of the line item. And if you try to invoice more, Knowify will give you a warning that you cannot invoice a larger amount than the value of this line item of the contract. If you prefer to not use percentages, you can click the drop-down option at the top of the screen to enter your completed work in dollar figures just like you do with stored materials. This way, if you have more specific amounts that you need to invoice, you can use a dollar figure to enter in the exact amount you'd like to invoice instead. Similarly, the third option removes stored materials and just allows you to enter the exact amount that you want included on this invoice. And the last amount will allow you to invoice in units if you set up your contract with units on each line of the schedule values. For now, we'll enter in our values in completed work and stored materials and finalize this invoice. It'll confirm for you the total payment you're requesting in this application and the total amount that's being retained, and you can create an invoice that will be sent to the client through Knowify. The invoice that's created will have a cover sheet and a schedule of values page to show the customer everything that you're invoicing and where you stand at this point in the project. The cover sheet will show how much you're invoicing, the total value of the contract, and the total amount being retained, and the continuation sheet will break it down at a line item level. The workflow will continue until the contract has been entirely billed at 100% of work completed on each line of the schedule of values. So if we select another date and adjust each of the lines to show 100% billed, please note that this means that the stored materials should be at $0 on each line of the contract when the rest of this is done. And you'll see that if you move the value from stored materials into work completed, Knowify knows not to rebill the value that was automatically invoiced as stored materials on a previous application. And when the total adds up to 100% of all items, you'll see that you have the option to either include retainage in this invoice or invoice it separately. If we uncheck this box and finalize the invoice, it'll include retainage on this specific application. If not, you'll see that retainage is still withheld, and you'll be able to create a retainage-specific invoice later on to close out the project. We'll go back to the contract, and you'll see the button now reads Invoice Retainage Now, and if we click this, Knowify will automatically create an invoice for the amount retained to date. By default, this comes out in the standard Knowify invoice format, but you also have the ability to create a retainage invoice in the AIA format instead. If we return to the contract, and instead of invoicing retainage, reduce the retainage percentages to 0, then select the Invoice Now option, and then we'll make sure to uncheck the Invoice Retainage Separately option. When we go to Verify and Finalize, you'll see the amount of retainage is being reduced in the same amount as the payment due. We'll finalize this invoice and it'll come out in the AIA format instead. Now we'll cover how to map and sync invoices from Knowify to QuickBooks. Clicking the QuickBooks logo in the top right-hand side of the screen will bring you to a page where you can find your income defaults. This is where you can set the default service used when an invoice is mapped from Knowify to QuickBooks. And then down below, you'll be able to override that default and set a default income service for specific clients at a time. In this case, Flanagan Associated will go to sales instead of the service default that's specified at the top. And if you need to be more granular with your mapping than setting the service at the overall client level, then you can click the gear icon next to each line of a contract and associate which product or service from QuickBooks you'd like to use when creating an invoice for this item. And any lines of the contract that don't have an item associated with it will automatically default to the one set at the client or overall company level. So in this case, since we set up the site prep and demolition item for demolition, but nothing for framing, when we view this invoice in our QuickBooks account, we'll be able to see that that's how it's mapped on each line of the QuickBooks invoice. You can see the site prep and demolition item on the demolition line and service, the default for the company, for the framing line. For invoice payments, these are also synced with QuickBooks and can work in both directions. From inside the invoice, we can click Record Payment and enter in the amount that the client has paid us on this invoice so far. Once this is recorded, it'll automatically enter a payment into our QuickBooks account. So if we view this invoice in our QuickBooks account again, we'll see that one payment has been made and the invoice is still partially open. In viewing this payment in our QuickBooks account, we could see the bank account that this was deposited to, and this happens from the income default mapping that was covered earlier. If we go back to Knowify to our income defaults, we can see that the default payment account is set to bank, and we can override this and set a default payment account for each client below. And if you prefer to manage payments in your QuickBooks account instead of recording them in Knowify, any payments that are recorded in QuickBooks against invoices that came over from Knowify will sync back and close out the invoice that was created in Knowify. We'll record a payment here. Then when we open up the invoice in Knowify, it'll search for a new payment in QuickBooks and automatically pull it in to update the outstanding balance. We can see the payments at the bottom of the screen, and this invoice has been closed and fully paid.